Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our session today on 3 ways to improve your supply chain monitoring. My name is Chandler Thornton. I am the EiQ content marketing lead based in Hong Kong, and I'm joined today by JP and Alex. I'll let them take over and introduce themselves shortly. But yeah, we know that supply chain monitoring is quite often a buzz phrase that we hear a lot, and without real resources sometimes to back it up or to help you implement it effectively. So we wanted to hold the session today to really give you kind of the actionable tools you need to help gain more of that ongoing visibility of your supply chain's health. So with that, just a few of our housekeeping reminders. As you all know, you're going to be set to mute during the webinar. Please feel free to use the chat box to enter questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but if we happen to not get to your question, we will get back to you at the end of the session. So please, if anything comes up, be sure to throw it in there. The webinar is also being recorded, so you'll receive a link to the recording following the session, followed by an email, and you will be able to download it from there. So with that, I'll hand over to JP and Alex, who can introduce themselves and let you know why we're covering this today. JP?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is JP Stevenson. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for EiQ. I think we're having this discussion today because we've seen, especially recently, a lot of what can go wrong with both, general approach to supply chain compliance, responsible sourcing, but also specifically in the myriad of monitoring solutions out there in the market. Our position today is, of course, a little bit biased by having what we think is the world's best monitoring solution specific for supply chains. But I hope today, if anything, you walk away with a few insights that'll be useful for you thinking about how you might approach program design differently, or at least think about how you might shift some of your program qualities from being reactive, being on the back foot, to something that's a little bit more proactive through thinking differently about monitoring.
Thanks, JP. Thanks, Chandler. My name's Alex. I'm a business development manager for EiQ, and I've worn a couple hats within LRQA and EiQ. I sat in the consulting team prior to joining the EiQ team, where I was helping responsible sourcing teams and risk assessment and program design. So straight into JP's points there, helping companies design risk management programs to combat all the changing risks that we're seeing is definitely a passion of mine, and EiQ is definitely a tool that helps with this. So looking forward to diving into these topics.
Great. Thank you both so much. We're excited to have you. Maybe just to start off, we talk a lot kind of about the increasing media scrutiny on businesses, and it's really difficult to kind of hide from these really critical violations that are showing up in the supply chain. And we see, really the true impact of ineffective monitoring systems. And so, JP, maybe you can speak to this of, where do you think are the holes of these programs when they're being caught on the back foot of these hidden risks and when they're showing up in sort of this kind of massive way?
Yeah, thanks, Chandler. Good question. Maybe first, let's start by looking at what's happening in trade today. Now, and actually the past 5 years or so has been fairly unique from the standpoint of the past few decades, in that the U.S.-China trade relationship, the tariff environment coming out of the world's largest consumer market has unfrozen supply chains. A lot of folks are looking at new countries of origin and trying to think differently about who their supplier partners are in a way that mitigates the damages of the tariffs, but also encourages supply chain resilience. So I think this is where we see the first gap. New suppliers are coming on board. Actually, the trade environment with China was relatively mature. I think, obviously there was a clear set of problems that exist with that sourcing relationship. However, the checks and balances had been built out. In working with new suppliers, there are not those checks and balances in new markets. So we oftentimes see that folks have no real mechanism of profiling risk. And that risk, I think, can come in two forms. First, different markets have different risk criterias that obviously something like an audit or taking a risk-based approach to program design can help you profile so you know how to mitigate them. But you probably are not fully aware of the operating requirements of operating in a place like El Salvador for textiles, whereas in China it's relatively clear cut. But then the second point that I would make is then the upstream risk associated with it. What we've learned in the past 5 years is that when we decouple from China, it is not a fundamental decoupling. In fact, it is a lengthening of the supply chain as new actors are brought in as intermediaries. So I would also add, outside of just the risk profile, what's happening on site with your tier one production, which you might have a feel for now. If you're brought into the discussion with procurement, you probably do not have visibility into the upstream risks associated with folks that may be new actors, may not be new actors within your supply chain, but perhaps are obscured to you from having an additional link in the supply chain built in. So those are two holes that I think that we see that have caused some programs to maybe be a little bit more caught off guard when something hits the news and some NGO has found something out there that implicates them. I'd also maybe just add as a final point, what's interesting about today is the state of digitalization within the supply chain is so much more than it was even 5 years ago, or in this kind of steady state trade environment that we were in before that. And why that's important is a digitalized supply chain is one that has many more points of visibility to it. So in so much as, now there's new actors, there's new data points, it's also more externally visible to actors if they take an interest in your supply chain, because the factory is not necessarily a black box. It's uncertain. There are uncertainties around it, but it's also something that can be pieced together if the right organization takes an interest in what your supply chains look like.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think the point of tariffs is obviously really pertinent because, as you said, it can just create a difficult situation for people that may be onboarding or sourcing in new areas quickly, and trying to get quick visibility over what those issues could be with new suppliers or new partners. And I know you both will speak more to that later as well, but it's very interesting context. And with that, Alex, I know you said you had a lot of experience in consulting as well. So I think you have a good view on sort of the audit standpoint, which I believe this conversation is something we also speak about a lot. People do know at this point that audits kind of are not enough to be able to get the clear view of your supply chain risks. But can you maybe speak a bit more to that? Because we still see that transition is slow, or sometimes people are still relying on these kind of once a year assessments. So can you speak to this slide a bit more?
Definitely, Chandler. The need for diversifying your avenues and tools for risk assessment and supply chain management is definitely where companies are moving towards, right? But what we're seeing as these laggers in updating their responsible sourcing programs and predominantly looking at audit-based due diligence is, the shortfalls are really around audits are kind of static in nature. They're just providing that one-time snapshot and not really reflecting the ongoing changes at the facility. So having that, it's missing that continuous monitoring of your risks as you're only looking at it at one specific moment within the year. And, another shortfall is around frequency and timing of the audits. They're typically periodic, which means, again, they're only capturing that certain point in time. Having tools adapted around that, where you're engaging with the supplier outside of that audit cycle, is important. And then, onto resource intensity as well. These responsible sourcing programs and the clients I've been working with, a lot of their day-to-day is around audit management, report management and verification and using it within their own systems. So it's a great resource intensive activity for the supply chain teams that divert attention away from other monitoring exercises that they could otherwise be doing. And then last point, from like a supplier standpoint, audit fatigue's already been mentioned before, and is definitely an area that the industry is looking at. But in some cases, audits management view them as just a compliance exercise rather than a tool for improvement. So like that can lead to a lack of engagement or just ticking the box for the audit itself. And rather than creating capacity to make them resilient within all of the risks that they're exposed to in this day and age. Yeah.
Yeah, Alex, I think you bring up a couple great points with it. It is a little bit baffling that many of the world's largest consumer product brands, probably including the folks that are on this call today, will spend millions of dollars on issuing audits for sites. And audits are great. We do a lot of audits. We do a lot of really good quality audits. But I'll give you an example. Going on a shadow audit, a few months ago, factory looked clean, everything looked good. A few days later, there was a fire at the factory. Do you think that is necessarily captured in that snapshot that you see within the audit record? Probably not. That's a natural limitation of the methodology. Similarly, cases where there's injuries to workers, you don't pick up on that when you're on site. And so I think, somewhere in the history of how these responsible sourcing programs evolved, there was a singular focus on a given tool as the right methodology. When I think actually, if we take a step back and look at it, what happens, the other 360 days of the year when you're not in the factory, hasn't really fully been built out to many programs. And I think that's hard. It's hard, especially now, given that supply chains are becoming unfrozen. Your procurement team might be doing pilots without you even necessarily knowing, and there are real risks with these sites, even those that that perhaps aren't captured within the way that you are doing your due diligence.
That's super interesting. And also, even just to that point, when you're kind of looking at this risk heat map from EiQ, I think, JP, you and I have spoken about this before previously as well, where, if you rely too much on one single source of data to kind of portray this risk heat map or risk view, it can be vastly different from when you're integrating, those other data sources, which I know you guys will expand on more later. But, you can really get a false perception of kind of the vulnerabilities from a certain supplier or sourcing region if you're solely relying on audit data.
Yeah, absolutely. I would even say, that there has been this great framework and starting point for the industry in, OECD guidance on human rights due diligence and how we think about the buckets of risk that we cover. You have to look at labor issues, health and safety issues, environment, business ethics, management systems. But the tools that we have available today and where we look to undertake that due diligence, I think actually that's where the frameworks that we use need to be a little bit more expansive with it, especially given that we are seeing shifts in what the data is that could be available actually for running due diligence, or equally on the flip side, making a case that a supply chain is actually not up to snuff. Well, one example, and then I'll let you continue, Chandler, that I think is
a good
interesting.
segue also.
Yeah. So I think the data sources, to your first point, can be relatively fragmented, and you might not necessarily look at an issue like stakeholder relationships in your supply chain, and how that might within the bounds of, again, these 5 categories of risk, implicate you. But what we have seen is when WROs are issued, when problematic actors are identified within the supply chain, there is more and more outside data that uses stakeholder interest or shareholder interests, beneficial ownership as an example, as a way of implicating you with your tier 2 supplier. And I just think perhaps without being explicitly asked up front to look at that question, a lot of responsible sourcing teams are missing that in their approach to running their due diligence.
Yeah, it's a good point. And Alex, I don't know if you can maybe speak to this as well when your work with clients, kind of where you see they're falling short, maybe just on these sort of points that are outlined here, especially for being like reactive and supplier transparency gaps, perhaps even data quality as a point that can really impact the effectiveness of your monitoring.
Yeah.
So sorry to, Alex, you go.
Cheers, JP. Yeah, to be fair, like reactive and proactive is a great point there, right? Around like we're touching on obviously those tools that are being used, but then like obviously we're seeing more diversification in the supply chain as well, right? You don't want to be at the whim of one market and one industry in terms of your manufacturing hub, environmental disasters, political unrest. So diversifying that supply chain is another area that we're seeing reactive supply chains lacking. And then also more internally, the kind of integrating of other business units within responsible sourcing, right? So within the platforms, data-driven platforms, including sourcing or legal into the responsible sourcing business units will make it a more proactive activity, right? At the moment, it's just reactive. It's all on responsible sourcing, but incorporating them. So purchase order decisions based on social compliance scores is another area that kind of turns responsible sourcing programs into more proactive and leveraging those risk insights that we're capturing. Yeah.
I just also add to that I think the approach to risk management that a lot of programs are using today is codified under like very black and white terms what the escalation path might be for a given supplier. So degrade supplier, zero tolerance is found. Exit them within the supply chain, maybe if your organization permits it. And I think actually the challenge that we're seeing now, both raised by monitoring programs and also just greater visibility into supply chain practices, is oftentimes programs don't have absolutes. I mean, allegations that you might potentially be connected with a problematic actor are not like definitive guidance. It is not something that is found in the same concrete terms that findings are when you run an audit with that. However, organizations still need to have an answer to that for a few reasons. One, it can implicate them and damage them reputationally. But two, also, for your responsible sourcing program being fit for purpose, you are absolutely not going to have data clarity over most of what you see within the supply chain. And so at least having the ability to grapple with these gray areas that might present themselves is important because it is not a singular approach. I'd say that the other thing that I see a lot with the supply chain monitoring programs that are out there in the market is that so tech that we have around data has by and large been built in the West. And that means now that like the concept of an adverse media screening tool or something of that nature is mature and well understood in consumer markets. a lot of the solutions out there are not necessarily built around the realities of the supply chain, where it can be highly localized, local language data sources that would form the basis for actually a supply chain claim being made. And I think that's a problem for folks. Uh, uh, Western tools for running a lot of these checks, I think certainly serve their purpose and have served their purpose within, the finance sector. But I don't want Dun& Bradstreet to run my supply chain due diligence program because they are not of the production market nor familiar with grappling with these difficult, ambiguous issues and the sources of data that would oftentimes go into a claim being alleged about a supply chain.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that sets us up perfectly, honestly, because, we've kind of given the context now of sort of the impacts of what ineffective monitoring can do, and then, why it's important to implement and improve. And so now, JP and Alex will really get into the actionable, 3 ways of how you can really start to hit the ground running and start to improve this. And JP already kind of spoke to the adverse media tool and the development of this. So maybe you can just expand further on how we can start to really implement this and what it is best practice for these sorts of tools.
Yeah. Hey, so I'd say drawing from our body of work with development finance institutions, one real practical question that you should ask yourself about your monitoring program, and this ties to the idea of what's too great to work in, is without having concrete evidence on a site, if something comes up that is adverse media related to an actor within your supply chain, and it is truly a zero tolerance claim, knowing that it is alleged, knowing that you will not necessarily have concrete proof on it. Are you comfortable making a business decision and continuing with that actor? And it is not a one size fits all approach. I would say what we are seeing within certain sectors is that if there is not the requisite level of transparency into operations, if one of these flags do come up, the actor will be cut out around in the supply chain. But I think you need to answer that question for your organization. Second, even more basically from a process design standpoint, it is actually running a type of check around this, a prerequisite to beginning to order from a factory. And I think compliance teams, you need to be really honest with yourself and where you sit in the organization and your relationship with procurement, because my guess is that many of you have also struggled to build a relationship where you can, on their time frame, actually get back to them with something that's useful. Not to plug too much of what we do, but one of the reasons why we have EiQ now built in a way that it can run real-time checks is exactly for that problem. Inventory moves quickly. You need to have your monitoring program move just as quickly. Um, Outside of that, I would say final area, like if you don't have staff that can review a lot of the contents, especially local language, and you are, say, primarily sourcing from China, you might think about actually how you work with someone that does, because again, the local language exposure is actually really important for finding what has often used to allege that there is a problem with a certain supply chain. And that might be stuff that you're just not picking up on today. So I'd say that's probably at least it from my end. Alex, anything for you to add?
Great points, JP. I'm agreeing with all of them. And use cases for adverse media and layering it into your risk due diligence. I think you've pretty much hit it on the case, on the point there around onboarding and continuous monitoring. One area I've seen a few clients use it for as well is kind of reshaping or when you're reevaluating your program and you're capturing all these risks in terms of that historic analysis, right? Maybe a supplier has specific adverse media hits on health and safety or labor violations. Tailoring your monitoring program to include those non-compliances, making sure they're captured, definitely an area that can add value and, build a robust responsible sourcing program. So that's the only area I'd add on to JP's great points there.
That's such an interesting point, actually. I mean, I do think some people, when they think about framing their supplier code of conduct, it is a one and done approach, whereas and it's oftentimes primarily, gap analysis with legislation and a review of your audit findings that go into it. But the ability to benchmark relative performance and also then capture a broader pool of data on how your supply chain is actually performing. We definitely see gaps with that, where there are certain things that you don't really have any type of codified cover for.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So with adverse media, it's important to really focus on the maturity of it, the ability to kind of detect in local languages so that you can cover more ground. And as you can see here, kind of the different issues that this can hone in on and expose for you that maybe wouldn't otherwise come up from just an audit. And so then moving on then, as we talk about sort of the supplemental data that's needed for improved monitoring, what about grievance data? Alex, maybe you can speak to this of just how kind of grievance channels and sort of that, those supplemental data points that you receive from that can really add to and improve monitoring as well.
Totally spot on, right? So like grievance mechanisms they used to be just a collection box in a staff room, and they're evolving broadly due to the need for risk capturing and collecting all of that insight, and then also regulations as well. But like it's a straight from the source, right? It's collecting data not only to remediate those grievances, but companies have this opportunity to collect it, analyze it, and then use it as part of the benchmarking exercise that you're getting risk insight on geography and product and also adverse media screening. And then you're layering in workforce raised grievances, that really straight from the source sort of insight to help inform your risk monitoring and capacity building, your training activities within your program. So it's really highlighting those potential issues before they're escalating into significant problems. So it's definitely an early warning system there. Another point to it is grievance mechanisms are really fostering and promoting stakeholder engagement. It provides transparency, accountability, fostering for stronger relationships with the suppliers, their employees, and any external stakeholders that you have as well within the company, shareholders, customers, or NGOs, etc. And then to that point I made on regulations, right? CSDDD is actually mentioned grievance mechanism, and one particular that comes to mind around EUBR, European battery regulation, where they've specifically referenced the UNGP effectiveness criteria in their due diligence in the regulations. So having those 7 effectiveness criterias, it's moving grievance mechanisms not only to a nice to have and an industry leading, but almost a compulsory requirement, and not just that suggestion box in the staff room, but a robust system that captures the data. You have proper protocols for analyzing that data and then using it in risk monitoring exercises. So it's another tool that really builds and makes a robust responsible sourcing program.
Yeah, I'd just add on to that too. So obviously you have your own internal grievance mechanisms that you can set up, and by the way, we do run some really great ones that have a good amount of float. Like there's a lot of issues that are surfaced from it. If you don't see the issues, your grievance mechanism probably isn't working. But I would also add that in certain regions, China is a great example. you have a strong public interest in monitoring worker well-being and satisfaction. We track province-level grievance mechanism data in local languages that are surfaced as a part of our screening tool, Sentinel. And that's been really valuable for addressing what are otherwise hard to find issues like around wage payments. Very, very common for those documents to be doctored in China. If you don't have something like a grievance mechanism in place, you can oftentimes miss out on it just even if you have a pretty good audit system. The second thing that I would also just say on that as well too, if you're looking at bigger challenges or initiatives that you're trying to take on, like say living wage programs or progress, or it's quite important to actually have a grievance mechanism in place as a way of building out what happens offsite when the measurement is after the measurement is done. Because again, wage disputes are amongst the most common issues that workers have. And if you are giving some type of preferential access to capital to factories that are making progress on it, as we have started to see, you would want to make sure that you have a system for running that checkup on them. And GMs, I think, should be a prerequisite, as are audits, for validating that.
We've gotten a good question from the audience, which you both have kind of alluded to, but I think might be good to concisely kind of summarize. And they said, when integrating grievance data and adverse media, how do you ensure that the insights are actionable and not just noise? What does good signal detection look like in practice? Maybe this speaks to a bit of kind of the support and expertise that you need in conjunction with technology. I don't know if either of you.
I guess I would reassert that having a really clear escalation path or grappling with messy data is fundamental to successfully integrating grievance mechanisms or adverse media. The reason being, again, that the nature of the data that's underlying it is not concrete. And you will be challenged on, the potential subjectivity of the allegations for it. But even if it is subjective, it does not necessarily mean that it is not informative and should not be used from a supply chain governance standpoint. In fact, it's oftentimes the canary in the coal mine for a much bigger problem there. And so I think that you need to look at, for example, and we have seen this happen in a bunch of client organizations, what's the path that you potentially have to escalating, certain issues that come up to the board and away from procurement, or with the right stakeholders in the organization that can action it if something is less concrete. But again, there is this risk of real damages to both your reputation and also those that make up your supply chain.
Yeah, I'd agree with those points, JP. Great, to point out around signal detection as well, as Chandler's question has, right, from the audience. It's definitely making sure that these tools have machine learning or language learning inbuilt within them, right? So make sure that the relevancy of the data that you're collecting is not noise, right? Just not noise, but actionable insights as well. And then really, as JP alluded to, those kind of frameworks that you build out around defining the association to you, the business, the brand, and then if it is directly related or at least indirectly, establishing those protocols for the investigation response and ensuring actual insights. So yeah, bundling all of that up with regular monitoring and reviewing, potentially quarterly reviews of the data you're collecting. Okay, how does this look compared to our audit data? What sentinel adverse media hits are we getting, or what grievances are we receiving? And benchmarking that really improves the monitoring and making sure that it isn't just noise, and that risk detection is going into practice in supply monitoring activities.
Yeah, that's really useful. So with that, we kind of outlined the first one, which is sort of the supplemental data that's needed. And now the second strategy we've kind of outlined here is, prioritizing data quality. And this, means how can we improve transparency within that so that we're effectively monitoring and having more tailored data sets to our program specifically, rather than just sort of, the one size fits all that we've talked about before.
Yeah, absolutely. Your supply chain monitoring program can only be as effective as the quality of the data that is going into it. And that, again, does not necessarily mean dismissing, smoke when when you can't see the fire, but rather making sure that you are working with the proper rigor when it comes to actually your supply chain, especially if your teams are sitting in the West. Like, I cannot emphasize this enough. Like, if you are sitting in the West, primarily buying from the East, you don't have boots and grounds. Like, that's a little bit of a red signal in terms of needing more rigor in how you would probably be reviewing how actors within your supply chain are operating.
To add to that
Alex,
as well, thanks, Chandler. Just on those points, like we were showing there, the supplier scorecard, right? And that tool is invaluable to suppliers, and making sure that we're going beyond just an audit score within the supplier scorecard. And as I mentioned earlier on, like including other business units into it, having that visibility for all of the business units when making those sourcing decisions really helps be conscious of the risks that might be involved. So those historic data, the sentinel hits, the grievance mechanisms, the geography risks and product risks, they're all centralized into one area. And then, you can then take that from a single supplier to, as you're showing here, those macro level data points, right? Having those dashboards that kind of feed in real-time risk data from all of your activities really helps with prioritizing and identifying those focus areas that might be increasing in risk from your last year of your program's activities. So, yeah.
I'd also just say on that, like, partner with your buyers, like those that are actually managing inventory positions. One of I think the things that bothers me is this allegation that, like, getting to your tier 2, tier 3, knowing who makes up your supply chain is not possible. It's not difficult. It's not that at all. It's that you are not having enough direct communication with your buyers, with your procurement teams, to actually use the leverage that you have to name it. Because if they really want to find out actually who makes up their supply chain actors so that you can build out a better monitoring program, they're going to be able to. It's determined by the leverage that you have.
Mhm. Absolutely. And with, kind of the leverage point even, and we get into our final sort of strategy, which I've actually even heard from quite a few clients, kind of the impact of what they've seen from implementing more supplier training and collaboration. But maybe you can both touch on, why implementing tools for sort of digital training or engaging suppliers for wider awareness of standards can really help improve with that sort of transparency and ongoing monitoring as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Alex.
Jump in first there, but like, yeah, JP can follow on from this, but really, like, going beyond just the audit is where it's at now, like where we've been working with our clients and the tools that they're needing to use in their supply chain. So capacity building to make them resilient, turning reactive into proactive. And as you mentioned, like you've got those e-learning courses and really identifying the risks in advance. Really help the suppliers or the responsible sourcing team, the people on this call, with moving this forward. And you've shown a great slide here around EiQ site. Just the next one on, but yeah, there are other avenues as well to capacity building, and it captures one great that we're seeing a lot of clients use, and that's really giving their supplier the ownership of their social compliance responsibilities, right? It's a new trend of like social compliance for the supplier not being hounded directly from the brands themselves. So giving them this platform for insights into their own risks, their own adverse media within their industry can really equip suppliers to not only increase their own resilience to the changing risks outside, but then, feed back into the brand's own responsible sourcing efforts they have there.
Yeah, I'd say on that, first, the relationship that you have with your supplier, especially now when you're shifting your supply chains globally, is really fragile. Like, especially as the relationship becomes more transactional, more short-sighted, you have less leverage oversight, you have less ability to actually command the supplier to match your standards. And so, how are you counterbalancing the risk associated with that? I mean, there's risk mitigation strategies, but I do think if you're working under a base of suppliers where perhaps there is that fundamental disconnect in incentives, it's an uphill battle. I do think like digital learning can play a good role in that, especially now, given that there are so many very different regulated requirements that have come up, in particular out of the EU. And the really big manufacturing groups, you don't need to worry about them, but it's more the small and medium-sized enterprises that, still $100 million businesses that really probably are both less able to meet competing interests and also less interested and less really, really explicitly communicated. I'd also say that, that this idea of transferring more ownership onto the vendor is for sustainability a little bit newer, but it is actually not a new concept. The idea originates from a lot of the quality management systems that we saw beginning in the 70s and 80s. And I think that there are good lessons there around how you actually incentivize suppliers to be more vested in their own interests with it. But given that you are perhaps taking a step back in how explicitly you control that relationship, you still want to make sure that you have visibility into how their operations are working. So that's a bit the balance that has to be taken.
Yeah, those are great points, and this has been incredibly useful for me as well. I'm conscious of time at the moment, so I'm just going to give you guys one more question from the audience before we wrap up. But they said, how are programs driving innovation in this area? What are the ways to kind of spearhead real transformation rather than following standard approaches? So kind of how can they start to transition this change, I assume they're saying here, which I know you guys have spoken to a lot, but maybe just to kind of finalize here.
Great points. If I would summarize in 3 points, what I've got is I'm seeing brands with AI and machine learning introducing that into their risk monitoring programs, dynamic dashboards, making sure that you're capturing all the effort from your responsible sourcing team, their assessments and activities, making sure that it's insightful and actually actionable, and then automated alerts. Through adverse media screening, getting those ahead of any sort of risks and being quickly reactive is some of those key innovation points I'm seeing. How about you, JP?
Yeah, I'd say movement beyond like a one and done approach to your risk management where it's not like you just create the scorecards, you map the risks, and then you're not using them to monitoring. I think actually AI has been an incredible enabler for our ability to cut down on the coordination and information costs associated with having more regular monitoring, something that's proactive and built around a really high standard of data, but also one that is broad and incorporates many sources, some of which we've talked about today. And so I think if your work is still primarily focused on reporting and playing bad cop, you're probably not very future proof. I think you need to really switch to a frame where you are looking at even transaction level data to run your assessment, and call out when it's not working. I would also say as well, just fundamentally, again, if you were using an approach that is built primarily on self-reported information, and you do not have a system for actually reading local news or local data sources around it, you got problems. I mean, I don't think I need to explain that to you. It should be self-evident why that probably cannot match the compliance challenges faced today. But you cannot claim that your monitoring solution is effective if that's the case. So, yeah, in closing, I would just encourage folks to think broadly around the source of data that they use. Um, uh, and perhaps if they really want to actually like jump in the water and see the murkiness that exists within their supply chain, I'd invite them, reach out to us. Come and work with us, or join one of our audits, our shadow audits, where you will tour a factory and have something that brings nuance to what might other appear to be just data, but also I think will reinforce your belief in why working with the industry's best data for factory improvements is fundamental to your supply chain's health.
Yeah, and off of that, I'd also like to invite everyone, because we have a lot of these sort of resources on these topics, especially AI and kind of all of the exciting developments that are coming with that, and even in a lot of our podcast videos. So please be sure to check out our website as well as our YouTube channel so you can get more of this information. And we'll also be sending this slide. We won't go over all these kind of questions to ask yourself, but we will be sure to send this to you after the webinar ends. And then finally, also on AI, JP.
Yes. So we will be in New York. We are having EIQ's Global Summit in New York on September 24th. Reach out to me or on the event page itself to register. It will be a really great audience and really great speaker lineup. Many of the world's largest consumer goods companies are there. And if you, like many in this field, feel isolated in your organization because you are the single point of responsibility for looking after your supply chain program, then especially come. You will be alone no longer.
Yes, please do go visit the website. And we just want to thank you all again for joining today. Thank you both to JP and Alex for your incredible insights. We really appreciate your time. Again, if we didn't get to your questions, we will follow up directly with you afterwards. But thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Chandler. Thank you, JP. Thanks all. Bye.